Derrière vous, il suscite des débats passionnés depuis son adoption en 19...
As with many narratives about the African continent, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, while a relevant development, has become somewhat of a cliché, a catch-all phrase of all and anything that signals both opportunity and threat. The increasing digitization of production, routes to market, and distribution present great opportunity, but they also present significant hazards and dangers. In this episode of the Aporde podcast, we interrogate what the Fourth Industrial Revolution is, what its impact is going to be on households, workplaces, finance, and the broader continental and global economy. I'm Ayabonga Cawe, your host. Let's get straight into it. Well, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a term popularized by the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, refers to rapid changes in areas such as artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, genetic engineering, quantum computing, and many other areas that will certainly change how we live, how we produce, what we need to survive, and how, more importantly, we interact with each other. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, or the 4IR, is often spoken of in terms of the leading cutting-edge technologies that define it, rather than the material and social relations that underpin this transition. If one accepts in this case that finance and capital markets constitute a key part of the 21st century economy as we understand it, it's then unsurprising that such technology will change how finance not only functions, but the distributional consequences of how it does so, its impact on who gets what or who doesn't get what resources.
So when you talk about, digital industrial revolution, and if you want to explain what it is in one sentence, I would say increasing digital content in industrial production in all three stages of production is what Fourth Digital Revolution is all about. So we are looking at the pre-production stage, which is, the use of big data analytics, use of artificial intelligence to see what will be demanded, what quality will be demanded, and where it will be demanded, and how much to produce so that you do not have excess capacity. And then in the production stage, use of robotics, use of artificial intelligence, use of 3D printing, new manufacturing technologies, and use of digital skills. So all these are needed in in the production stage to increase the digital content of the industrial products.
In this episode, we consider what impact these technological and social advances will have on different economic actors on the continent, and what all of this is going to mean for the structural transformation and diversification of African economies. To unpack these issues further, we caught up with Rashmi Banga, Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva. Rashmi shared the experiences of Ethiopia on areas quite crucial to the structural transformation of the economies of the continent.
Yes, we have a project which is under the UN sub-funding on Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, where Ethiopia is one of our pilot countries, and we are sharing successful policy experiences of other developing countries with Ethiopia in the areas of macro and economics, finance, trade, industrial policy, as well as debt sustainability. And we look very closely at what are the experiences which can help Ethiopia in structurally transforming itself, mainly digitally transforming itself as well. So just to give you an example, we look very closely at what did China do to become a digital leader. China was a manufacturing hub of the world, and then today it is a digital leader. So what were the policies that were put in place in the digital economy which helped China to progress and digitally transform itself? So we are not saying that, countries can imitate China and do what China did, but there are some very key policy lessons which can be derived from China's experience and then adapted to the ground reality, especially in Ethiopia. For example, looking at what were the startup policies which China put in place so that it was able to get Alibaba. So what should be done by Ethiopia for its digital startups so that they can also become bigger and more progressive in their operations. So that kind of policies we are sharing with Ethiopia. Also with respect to COVID response, what could be the right response at this point of time to revive the economy, and then also the trade sectors. And so these are the policies that we are sharing with Ethiopia. We are working very closely with the Policy Study Institute of Ethiopia, PSI.
Now, participation in this emerging digital economy is important for any country that is interested in influencing the path of structural changes in its economy. This is why this notion of digital industrial policies is so important. The way China, for instance, managed and continues to manage its digital policies alongside its other interests is quite revealing of how digital channels can be used to complement other parts of a country's policy agenda. One can imagine that the proliferation of fast fashion, for instance, via e-commerce channels like Shein, have not only influenced the design, manufacturing, and retail parts of the clothing value chain, but have also had an impact on the execution of clothing and textile industrial policy in countries like South Africa, Lesotho, Madagascar, and Kenya. In many ways, this influences the future path of industrial policy on the continent, these e-commerce and digital channels. An example of this, if we consider industrial policies in Ethiopia, for instance, which have sought to attract investments in clothing and textile manufacturing via public funding of dedicated industrial parks, as a UNIDO release suggested in 2016.
5 years ago, there were 60 factories and 25,000 workers in Ethiopia. Nowadays, there are more than 130 factories and 60,000 workers. In order to meet the growing demand of the factories, the government supports and promotes industrial parks as a development tool. Here we are at Bole Lemi, close to the Addis Ababa Bole International Airport. Built with public funds, the 200-hectare industrial park is available for entrepreneurs.
We are doing the construction from our meager resource, from our treasure. So this is an indication for the potential investors. The potential investors, they should not really spend time in searching for land, constructing, going here and there. They just come with their own machinery and equipment and start their production.
What impact, if any, are some of these developments of broadening digital and e-commerce channels going to have on the effectiveness of industrial strategies in textile-producing areas like Ethiopia and Lesotho? The impact of the fourth industrial revolution and its lead technologies on industrial development is not only confined to the shop floor, but also influences the allocation of capital in the global economy. After all of the financial resources required to fund industrial developments have to come from somewhere. Somebody who's considered this issue in great detail is Dr Milford Bateman. He's an adjunct professor of development studies at St. Mary's University in Canada. Dr. Bateman's work looks at the relationship between finance and technology. He highlights how early microfinance models failed and how these were later replaced with financial inclusion and fintech, or financial inclusion via fintech solutions, many of which were pioneered here on the continent.
We then moved on to microfinance, which is a slightly wider suite of financial services, includes microfinance, microcredit very much so, but also micro savings, micro leasing, micro insurance, etc. Now, when the microfinance model was seen as failing, it was by the mid-2000s, it was fairly clear that there were major problems, and there was a fear that the whole concept was going to collapse. And so this is when a new idea, a new narrative came along to cover for this collapse and to enable the microfinance industry to keep going, called financial inclusion. So that then became the major narrative governing the microfinance industry, and many microfinance industry advocates and institutions renamed themselves financial inclusion industries, financial inclusion institutions, and the individuals became financial inclusionistas. And then we get to the technology aspect, because around the time that the financial inclusion narrative was being introduced by such as the World Bank, although I have to say it was pioneered very much in South Africa, by people associated with the British government programme's financial sector deepening. Then technology arrived in the form of fintech. And fintech's great claim to fame in terms of development, I mean, it makes a lot of money for the investors, but in terms of development, fintech is going to achieve this great goal in the sky, full financial inclusion. So that's where the connection now is between microfinance and technology, because we have this new thing called fintech, and all the old microfinance institutions, the old bricks and mortar institutions, are now either adopting fintech and rapidly downsizing their employees as they move their service onto internet platforms, or else they're buying existing fintechs, or else they're closing down and other people are setting up new fintechs. So that's an important link, and that's where we stand today, where microfinance is very rapidly transitioning to the internet, cutting the number of employees that are needed, and making just as much money as before.
It's clear that the impact of fintech has not only occurred via financial channels, but it has had major implications for real economy outcomes insofar as employment, investment, and profitability is concerned. Bateman argues that the whole notion of financial inclusion through fintech channels is not a panacea for sustainable economic development challenges of many emerging market economies, least of all those on the continent, but presents a new avenue of profitability for financial interests.
Now you turn to the microcredit model and you realize it's actually got the exact opposite objective. It actually mobilizes a lot of money from savings, from Western investors, and puts that money into exactly the opposite type of enterprises that countries need in order to develop. It puts them into people standing on the side of the street with a table selling avocados. It puts them into small retail operations done out of the back window of somebody's house, into fast food, into selling SIM cards on the street, into moving across borders to buy clothes and bring them back, into operations where they sell secondhand clothing, wash it, repair secondhand clothing or whatever. So once you realize that it's a way of making money in microfinance, that you serve these clients, and some people have tried to equate human rights with allowing these particular individuals the access to this funding if they want to wash and dry clothing and sell clothing on the streets. There is a human rights element to being able to access money that way. But the long and the short of it is that isn't how countries develop. If it was, the African continent has more informal micro-enterprises and self-employment ventures than any country or any continent on the planet, and yet it's not been able to develop as fast as any other continent on the planet. And there very clearly is a link between that. And if you look at those countries today, with fintech, and I'm looking at Kenya and Uganda, South Africa with Time Bank, these institutions are funding even more, channeling even more money into exactly the wrong types of business that are not going to develop and create the foundations of successful economies. In fact, they are the complete opposite. But the reason they're doing it is because you can make fantastic amounts of money by doing so. So that's the fundamental problem with microfinance there, that it sets countries off in completely the wrong direction.
Even the development of fintech solutions in many developing countries have largely focused on payment fulfillment channels rather than other financing market failures that make industrial development difficult. There's a lot to learn from many emerging economies' experiences, and seemingly there's a lot that many of our emerging economies here on the continent of Africa can teach the world as well.
Now, in Nairobi, paying with bills on your mobile, it's easier than, frankly, anywhere else. Now, I'm not talking about contactless or any nonsense where you're Venmoing or PayPaling. I'm talking about where you literally walk into a shop or speak to somebody, they give you their number, you give them yours, bish, bosh, bosh, and it's all done, money transferred. Kenya has become a world leader in the mobile banking revolution, and it's all thanks to the system M-Pesa. It was launched by Vodafone's Safaricom, and in only a decade, M-Pesa has expanded its money transfer service to almost 30 million customers across 10 countries.
If we move on to one of the worst examples or the most dangerous examples, and this might come as a shock to some people, but if you know about a development called M-Pesa in Kenya, which is part of the Safaricom Corporation. Now, M-Pesa was started with the help of the British government as a way of pushing out more microcredit. It was then seen as a way of transferring money between people. It then started with that as its objective, but then added microcredit later on and all sorts of other services. It was also given a monopoly, which is very strange, since the British government was advising countries all over the world that they should try and have anti-competition laws and antitrust laws, and you've got to have competition because this is what economic development is all about. But in the case of M-Pesa and Safaricom, they deliberately engineered a monopoly for M-Pesa by supporting a number of the elite in Kenya to make sure that the Kenyan government granted a monopoly to M-Pesa, and then these individuals that were able to influence the government were rewarded later on. I think they made about $100 million in the shares they were given in Safaricom when they sold them back to Vodafone. So M-Pesa became the pioneer in fintech, the world's pioneer, although China has got some great technological examples of the same thing. But M-Pesa now, almost all funds in Kenya run through M-Pesa. So you can't do anything now, buy anything, send money, save, take credit without going through M-Pesa, which means that they were able to take off a small amount from every financial transaction of the poor. So they accumulate an enormous amount of what's called transactional wealth. And that wealth it's bad enough that they do that because they're taking it from the very poorest sections of society, the people who want to lend or send $10, $20, $30. But they're not just taking that money as a form of tax off the poorest, so that the wealthiest members of Kenya don't pay anything. But much of this money, not all of it, because 35% of Safaricom is owned by the Kenyan government, which is a good thing, but the other percentage goes back to Vodafone and to investors, many of which are based in tax avoidance domiciles in the Caribbean and other places. So it's a great big sponge soaking up wealth from the poorest economies and then wringing out that sponge in Wall Street, City of London, Frankfurt, Beijing, or whatever. And so that's one of the worst possible ways. But that's the way that fintech, which is now the most important development in the global economy, or at least one of them, for many, many years, and certainly in this local finance space. You have companies like Net1, which was a genuine fintech company that managed to get hold of the social grant contract. So it was passing grants from the government to the poorest sectors of the economy. And they realized that this was a fantastic opportunity to make extra money from these customers, these clients, because they had a regular monthly income, which they could take if they bought something from Net1. Net1 could then deduct the repayments from their, I think it was $30, $40 a month payment automatically. So it was an absolutely risk-free endeavor for them to start selling crazy products to people who were already vulnerable, already in debt, but they would make a lot of money because they could take the money straight away. And so that's what they started to do. They started to sell all sorts of crazy things. The most craziest thing, of course, was more microcredit. And they started to just take all these payments from deduct them automatically, to the point where many people were receiving almost nothing from their $40 a month because they had somehow, and there was a little bit of, they shouldn't have done it. Clearly, they were hapless and unwise in doing it. But this is what vulnerable people do who are in poverty. And this is why people gamble and take drugs and whatever. And so they were making a lot of money. Now, the South African government stepped in, cancelled this. And the last I heard was Net1 is no longer doing this. I think they managed to make a lifeboat for themselves, and they're still doing some things there, but they no longer use fintech and microcredit as a way of draining wealth from the poorest economies, from the poorest communities, and siphoning it off to elites within South Africa, but also elites in the USA.
While it seems that these fintech solutions may help stimulate microeconomic activity, some adverse consequences lie beneath the surface. It does seem that the advance towards particular applications of technology, insofar as they've had an impact on industrial and other real economy policy, requires a clearly articulated digital policy.
We are looking very closely at the e-commerce policy, and digital payment is a very key to e-commerce platform success. So we are looking at what could be the e-commerce policy lessons that Ethiopia can derive from, let's say, Indonesia, from other developing countries, and how it can form its own national e-commerce platforms, and also have policy space in the digital economy so that it can put in place the right data policies. So we are working in this area with PSI.
The advance of digital technologies has also created geopolitical contests, least of all between Beijing and Washington, who have been in competition battling for supremacy over global e-commerce and technology development markets. The Chinese have been able to transition to being not only the factory of the world in a sense, but also a leading edge provider of digital technology and effectively the digital hub of the world. And there's some lessons that can be drawn from that experience that would be relevant for us here on the continent of Africa. One is that any industrial advance and accessing markets also requires a consideration of how policy can unlock digital markets through e-commerce platforms, while in some cases regulating competing imports.
China has a national digital policy, which is a very comprehensive policy, which looks at both demand and supply side. Just to give you an example, if you look at the e-commerce policy of China. Now, if you look at the e-commerce platforms in any other country in Asia or in Africa, you can import anything you want through e-commerce platform. And we forget e-commerce platforms are two-way platforms. It is not just, we are not just connected to the global market. All the global exporters are connected to your domestic market as well. So what China has done, China has a positive list approach. So it does not allow everything and anything to be imported through its e-commerce platform. So it regulates imports also on its e-commerce platform. And when it comes to cross-border exports through e-commerce platforms, it promotes Chinese products. Now in Africa, there is a Chinese e-commerce platform called Kiku, which sells only Chinese products. Now, how many of our countries in Africa and in Asia have national platforms selling only their country's products? I really don't know of any other platforms of this nature in Africa or in Asia. So these are the kind of things, lessons which African and Asian countries can learn from China, how to have a e-commerce policy that promotes exports of through e-commerce platforms and also regulates the imports through e-commerce platforms.
Thus, a national integrated and coordinated policy of digitally enabled trade and digitally traded goods is needed. Further, insofar as fintech and microcredit is concerned, it also has to link to activities that yield increasing returns to scale and expand the productive base as it currently stands, rather than just focus on consumer-facing industry and transactional and payment channels.
Now, for African countries, it is very important to increase their use of digital technologies as well as to produce, digital content. Now, how can that happen? That can happen only if African countries know how to process their data. We are, when it came to FDI policy, we talked about technology transfer agreements. But when it comes to digital policy, none of the countries have a digital technology transfer agreement with any of the developed countries, or we don't even talk about digital technology transfers. So when we invite, foreign firms, digital platforms, or big tech firms into our countries, we are not talking to them in terms of how are you going to, transfer technology to us? Is it through joint ventures? Are we looking at equity partnership? With FDI, we always said that, okay, you have to come in joint ventures in these particular sectors because we want higher domestic linkages and we want spillover effects. But when it comes to digital platforms and big tech firms, we are not looking at them in terms of digital technology transfer. So I think that is again one of the lessons in learning that can be, that is a takeaway from China, how to make sure that the big tech firms which come into your countries and which have, which come for data into your countries, they should process data in your countries, and also governments have to make sure that some kind of digital spillovers, technology spillovers take place so that African countries learn to process their data, learn to build digital content and digital technologies. We are just looking at being users of digital technologies right now.
When we come back, we explore the issues around data sovereignty and many of the issues Rashmi raises around maximizing linkages and positive spillovers of digital advances and what policy lessons we can learn from other experiences around the world. From me, Ayabonga Cawe, till next time.
Derrière vous, il suscite des débats passionnés depuis son adoption en 19...